Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. So before we even start, I just want to give a big shout out to my mom. She's the one that got me interested in history. This episode's personal because it's not just history for me. This is my bloodline. It's unfinished work my mom was doing before she passed away. She was on genealogy.com, trying to trace her side of the family back to Ireland, trying to figure out where we came from, what county, what town, what patch of dirt, and she never got to finish it. So yeah, this episode is me picking that thread back up, because if you've got Irish blood anywhere in you, this famine isn't a footnote. It's the reason you're not standing on Irish soil right now. Because this story explains a lot about how modern power lies, how empires excuse violence, and how racism gets laundered through paperwork. Let me paint a picture. You're watching your kids starve. Not metaphorically, not dramatically. I mean actually starving. Their stomachs are bloated. Their legs are sticks. They're quiet now. Too quiet. And outside your village, wagons full of food roll past. Grain, cattle, butter, all under armed guard. And you're told you can't touch it because it doesn't belong to you. This isn't a dystopian novel. It's fucking Ireland, 1847. So let's start where everyone likes to start, because it's comfortable. Yes, there was a potato blight. In 1845, a massive fungal disease wiped out the potato crop, the staple food of millions of Irish people. That part is true. But here's the lie that always follows. People say the famine was caused by the potato blight. Fuck no. The blight caused the hunger. British colonial policy caused mass death. Ireland was not out of food. Ireland was exporting food. And I'm not editorializing here. This is fucking documented. Grain, cattle, butter, and other foodstuffs were shipped out of Ireland throughout the famine, often under military escort. People were dying in ditches while food left the country. British officials at the time were obsessed with laissez-faire economics. The idea that markets should never be interfered with, ever. They also loved Malthusian theory. The idea that poor people reproduce too much, and famine is nature's way of fixing that. One of the key figures here is Sir Charles Trevelyan, the British Treasury official in charge of famine relief. And I want to be clear when I say this next part. This is quoted directly. Trevelyan referred to the famine as, quote, a mechanism for reducing surplus population, end quote. That's his fucking phrase. Surplus population. He also wrote that the famine was, quote, the judgment of God, end quote. And that helping the Irish too much would, quote, undermine the moral fiber of the people, end quote. That's the motherfucker in charge. And let's talk about the media. Because this wasn't just government policy. This was cultural. This is quoted from the Times of London, 1846. They wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, but keeping the meaning intact. They called the potato blight a blessing. A fucking blessing. They argued that the famine would force the Irish to stop eating potatoes and adopt English habits. Eat meat, work harder, become more disciplined. As if starving children were a fucking lifestyle correction. And here's the part that should make anyone furious. Ireland was producing enough food to feed its population, but the food wasn't considered food. It was considered property. Cash crops for absentee landlords, many of them living comfortably in England. There's a documented quote from a British official in County Mayo who asked, and again, this is paraphrased, but faithful, if starving tenants eat their grain, where will the rent come from? That's the logic. Rent first, people second, or third, or not at all. And let's talk about one of the most evil pieces of bureaucracy ever written. The Poor Law Extension Act of 1847. Inside it was something called the Gregory Clause. And here's how it worked. If you were starving and wanted aid, you had to surrender your land. All of it, except a quarter acre. That means even if you owned a tiny plot, you had to give it up to qualify for help. So the choice was simple: starve or become homeless. And landlords love this shit. Because now, evicting tenants meant they didn't have to pay famine taxes. So they evicted them. Entire fucking villages. Roofs torn off of cottages so people couldn't crawl back inside. Eyewitnesses described families wandering roads barefoot, carrying whatever they could salvage, while fields full of food sat untouched behind them. And this is where it stops being abstract for me. Because when my mom was digging through genealogy records, she wasn't looking for kings or castles. She was looking for why. Why her family left. Why we ended up here. Why is there this blank space in our story where Ireland should be? In this famine? This is the answer. Millions of times over. Most Irish families didn't emigrate. They fled. And let's talk about how they left. The ships were called coffin ships for a reason. Overcrowded, disease-ridden, barely provisioned. Mortality rates on some crossings hit 30 to 50%. Entire families boarded, and only one person disembarked. There are first-hand accounts of ships arriving in Canada where all the crew had died and bodies had to be pulled from the hold with hooks because survivors were too weak. And then comes the punchline nobody likes to hear. America didn't welcome them. Irish immigrants were met with signs that literally said, "No Irish need apply." They were caricatured as animals. And this is where American racism borrowed directly from British racism. Cartoons depicted Irish people as apes, violent, drunken, subhuman. Thomas Nast, one of the most famous American cartoonists, drew Irishmen as simian brutes alongside Black Americans. And the message was clear. You're not one of us. And here's why I'm doing this episode. Because people today still talk about famine like it's weather. Still talk about immigrants like they're a new problem. The Irish famine proved something uncomfortable. That mass death can be explained away as economics, morality, God's will, or how things were back then. So when people ask why this famine still fucking matters, why Irish communities remember, why this isn't ancient history, it's because this wasn't a tragedy. It was a choice. A series of choices. Signed, stamped, and enforced. And somewhere in those choices is the reason my mom never finished tracing our line back home. Because home was erased. You know, the famine wasn't an accident. You know, food left Ireland while people died. You know, this wasn't a potato story. It was a power story. Now comes the next phase. Because surviving the famine didn't mean surviving the consequences. It just meant carrying them somewhere else. By the late 1840s and into the 1850s, Irish refugees were trickling into the United States. I mean, they were flooding in. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, New Orleans. Whole neighborhoods changed almost overnight. Imagine cities with no social safety net, no welfare system, no real public health infrastructure. Suddenly absorbing hundreds of thousands of traumatized, sick, penniless people who spoke with accents, practiced Catholicism, and came from a country Americans already thought was backward. And here's the thing people miss. The Irish were not welcomed as victims. They were framed as a problem. Newspapers didn't say famine survivors. They said drunks, criminals, paupers, papists. And this is where we need to be honest. American racism didn't invent new ideas for the Irish. It imported them. British racial theory had already done the work. In Britain, the Irish had been described for decades as a separate race. Victorian racial theorists argued that the Celtic race was inferior to the Anglo-Saxon race. They measured skulls. They compared facial angles. And they consistently concluded that the Irish were closer to Africans than Englishmen. That fucking sounds insane right now. But it was considered science then. So when Irish immigrants arrived in the US, American elites already had a template, and they used it. And let's talk about imagery, because nothing reveals how people really think faster than satire. American publications like Harper's Weekly ran cartoons showing Irishmen as apes, huge jaws, low foreheads, clubs in their hands, and violent expressions. They were drawn next to black Americans, portrayed the same way, sometimes chained together. The message wasn't subtle. You are not fully human. You are not fit for citizenship. You are not trustworthy. And this wasn't fringe. This was mainstream media. But now we have to talk about the phrase everyone knows. No Irish need apply. This wasn't a myth. It wasn't exaggerated. It was printed. Job ads, store windows, newspapers. It meant exactly what it sounds like. If you were Irish, don't fucking bother. And if you were Irish and Catholic, oh shit, forget it. Employers openly said Catholics were loyal to the Pope, not the Constitution. The Irish voters were dangerous, lazy, and the Irish women were breeders. And this is the moment where Irishness becomes political poison. And then it gets organized. Enter the nativist movement. Groups like the Know Nothing Party didn't just complain about immigrants. They built a platform around stopping them. They wanted longer naturalization periods, limits on Catholic office holders, restrictions on immigrant voting, public funds cut from Catholic schools. They weren't hiding it. They believed democracy needed to be protected from the Irish. That should sound familiar. Anti-Irish hatred was never just ethnic. It was religious. Catholic churches were burned. Convents were attacked. In Philadelphia, anti-Catholic riots destroyed entire neighborhoods. Why? Because Catholics were seen as incompatible with democracy, too obedient, too communal, too foreign. Never mind that the Irish had just fled a colonial empire. To American nativists, they were the empire. And here's the cruel irony. The Irish arrived traumatized, starving, and sick. And instead of being seen as survivors of empire, they were blamed for urban poverty, blamed for crime, blamed for disease outbreaks. Cholera hits a city? Blame the Irish. Slums overcrowded? Blame the Irish. Wages drop? Blame the Irish. The same pattern repeats over and over. Power causes the problem, and the powerless get blamed. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because over time, the Irish did become accepted, but not by dismantling racism, by climbing it. After the Civil War, Irish Americans gained political power. Police departments, fire departments, city halls. They fought in wars. They aligned with American nationalism. And slowly, painfully, and conditionally, they became white. But that acceptance came with a cost. It often meant distancing themselves from African Americans, participating in segregation, and enforcing racial hierarchies instead of dismantling them. The Irish learned the rules, and survival meant playing along. And this is the part I can't separate from my own life. Because when my mom was tracing our genealogy, she wasn't just chasing names. She was trying to understand how we got here, why certain stories disappeared, why Ireland became a ghost word instead of a home. And this is why. Because survival required silence, assimilation required forgetting, trauma required distance, and generations later, all that's left is a question mark. And here's why this episode isn't nostalgia. Because the Irish famine created a blueprint. How to explain mass death without guilt. How to racialize victims. How to turn refugees into threats. How to rewrite cruelty as economics. That blueprint gets reused over and over. The Irish didn't leave Ireland because they wanted opportunity. They left because staying meant death. And when they arrived, they were told they didn't belong. So if your family came from Ireland, your story didn't start with immigration. It started with survival. And this final part's gonna step on some toes. Not because it's edgy, but because it's true. Every time I hear someone today say, "Go back where you came from," I want to ask a very simple question. Which boat? Because unless you're Native American, every single person listening to this came from somewhere else. No exceptions. None. Before anyone twists this into nonsense, let me say it clean. Native Americans are not immigrants. They didn't arrive. They didn't settle. They didn't cross an ocean looking for opportunity. They were already here. Everyone else, we showed up. Some with flags, some with chains, and some with nothing. But nobody else gets to pretend this land was waiting for them. And here's what drives me insane. People love to point at immigrants today and act like they're disruption, like migration is new, like desperation is suspicious, like borders have always existed the way they do now. They haven't. This entire country is built on layered migration, most of it forced, violent, or desperate. The Irish didn't come because America sounded fun. They came because they were starved out. Germans came fleeing war and famine. Italians came escaping collapse. Eastern Europeans came running from pogroms. Chinese immigrants were brought in, used up, and then blamed for existing. And Africans, they didn't immigrate at all. They were stolen. So when people talk about real Americans, I always want to know, real compared to fucking what? There's this myth that early European settlers were somehow different, that they were brave pioneers, hard workers, builders, and everyone who came later is a problem. That's fucking bullshit. The first Europeans didn't show up legally. There was no immigration system, no visas, no background checks. They showed up, claimed land that wasn't theirs, and built power through force. And here's where this gets uncomfortable for a lot of people. Because a huge number of Americans yelling about immigrants today have Irish ancestry, or from one of the other places I mentioned. Peoples whose great-grandparents were literally depicted as animals in newspapers. People whose families were told they were unfit for democracy. People who were once considered a racial threat. And now, they've forgotten. Or worse, they've rewritten the story so they were always accepted. They weren't. They survived long enough to be absorbed. Whiteness isn't biology. It's a membership card. And the Irish didn't have it at first. They earned it slowly, conditionally, and at a cost. By proving loyalty, by enforcing the system, by distancing themselves from people below them on the ladder. That's not moral failure. That's survival inside a rigged structure. But pretending it didn't happen? That's how the structure stays alive. Every generation has a group it panics about. The Irish were going to destroy America. Then the Italians, then the Jews, then the Chinese, then Mexicans, then Muslims, then refugees. Same language, same fear. They don't belong. They won't assimilate. They're dangerous. They're changing the country. Yeah, that's the point. The country has always changed. When my mom was tracing our family back to Ireland, she wasn't trying to claim ownership of anything. She wasn't looking for a flag to wave. She was trying to answer a question a lot of families never get to ask out loud. What happened to us? Why did we leave? What did we survive? What was taken? So let's settle this. Nobody listening to this gets to say this isn't an immigrant country. It is. It always has been. The only people who don't need to justify their presence are the people we displaced, ignored, and tried to erase. Everyone else, we're guests in someone else's house. Some of us stayed quietly, some violently, some with luck, but nobody arrived innocent. If you take anything from this episode, let it be this. History doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the people who remember honestly. The Irish famine wasn't ancient. It wasn't accidental. And its lessons aren't finished. Because the moment you forget that you came from somewhere else is the moment you start believing cruelty is new. This has been the Time Machine Diaries. Take care. Be safe. Fuck ICE.